lot about pro bono is pro bono service, the donation of professional services, is just for those who can't afford to pay for it. It's for losers who can't afford to pay, right? It's thought of in the same way as like welfare. It's like just for those who like need a handout. And what we want to dispel that, because it's actually completely bogus. And what we found actually is that some of the highest performing, best known nonprofits in this country rely heavily on pro bono. And then in fact, there's a strong correlation between success and use of pro bono, not the opposite. And one example of this is Donors Choose. How many of you know Donors Choose? So you got decent marketing. And I'm not going to argue with any of these whether or not they're a good organization, whether or not you believe in them all, that's beside the point. What's interesting about Donors Choose is that 20% of their budget is pro bono. 20%, if you look at their cost to operate, comes from pro bono resources, from lawyers, marketing, technology, etc. They raise a ton of cash, they've got a big budget, but 20% of their operating expenses they cover through pro bono. And furthermore, a lot of their cash donations are only possible because of that pro bono work and the relationships that help them develop. And I would say, in terms of their success, they've raised $130 million. They're in 50% of public schools in the US. And pro bono, if you talk to Charles Best, it was like they couldn't have done that without pro bono. Like that was a critical ingredient in getting them off the ground and all the way through the process. The Children's Creativity Museum. So it's easy to see Donors Choose started using pro bono from day one. It was part of their DNA. They're a name, they're huge, etc. This is an interesting contrasting story. It's a smaller organization, $2 million budget in San Francisco. And they started off not using pro bono really at all. So this is a story that's, I think, much more relatable in a way because they didn't start off doing it this way, but they figured out how to change. And what they found after 10 years of operating was that they were losing traction. Fewer and fewer people were using their facility. They're getting less and less funding. They were just starting to plateau. And they basically had to decide, should we reinvent ourselves and become more relevant, or do we just sort of see this out, right? And just follow this path. And I think most boards would have done the cowardly thing, I gotta sadly say, which is, let's just continue down the path and like just hope that lightning strikes or somehow people think about us differently. And the reason I would have said that is because they didn't have any cash. They're like, it's easy to say reinvent yourself, but we have no money. How can we reinvent ourselves? And someone had the chutzpah on the board to say, it doesn't have to be cash. And they went out and they got Landor, Lucasfilm, Adobe, DLA, and a bunch of others to help basically do the pro bono strategy work, rebranding, facilities to completely change their perception of the community, change their name, etc. And they have seen, I think it's a year-over-year 20% increase now in people using the service, revenue, etc. And again, it's because they had the courage to say we can make this happen even if we don't have the money. And I guess that goes to your point about like, even if you don't have the extra funds, it's having the courage and creativity to find a way to get there. The first one is scope. Scope is basically, it has two meanings. One is scope, meaning how big is the project? And the second one is how well defined is it, right? So one of the projects that often has the biggest problems with scope are websites. Because websites are big projects, and they tend to also have a hard time getting nailed down with very specifically what you need. They tend to change a lot over the course of the project, right? So it's a project that in general, and Stacy on our team here who deals with a lot of these projects can attest, websites are our hardest projects. And it's largely because of this reason, is that they're big scope, and the scope tends to change throughout the process. Right? The longer the project is, the greater the likelihood that your team will encounter challenges or the changes will happen in your organization. So it just increases the risk of that project, right? A project at 1 day versus 1 year is radically different risk just because life gets in the way. And then secondly, how well do you really know the scope, the definition of what you need versus, I generally know I need something sort of like this, but it's still pretty nebulous. There's nothing wrong with that. But it adds risk because you could end up with the wrong team, you could end up with the wrong definition, and there's a lot of things that could go wrong. Urgency. So I'll give you an example of like the worst possible project would be like bring in an event planner for your big gala the night before it happens. They'd probably be set up for failure. I'm just going to throw that out there as a guess, right? The challenge, Pro Bono is an awesome resource, not the least of which because it's technically free. One of the things that it is not as good at is being able to say, I will be done on February 3rd at 3 p.m., right? So projects where there is like an absolute deadline, and even worse so if that deadline's tomorrow, it can happen, but you're just taking a tremendous risk, right? Because more often than not, people are juggling multiple things. And in general, I would say pro bono projects generally get done 50 to 100% slower than expected. And I would say paid consulting probably gets done 25 to 50% slower than expected. So it's not that paid gets done at 100%, but generally it does take longer. So as you look at the projects that you put down there, if those ended up getting done in twice as much time as you'd expect them to, how pissed off would you be, right? And are there any projects on there that just fundamentally like you should not have on there because you're setting yourself and that team up for the situation you said, turning conflict into creativity, right? You're setting yourself up for a bad situation, right? So knowledge needed. Somebody on my team said the best form of pro bono would be a plumber coming in to fix your sink, right? Because plumbers are incredibly expensive. You don't really do that much screening of whether or not they have the right skills. And they don't need to know a damn thing about your organization to be effective. All you have to say is, there's the sink, it don't work, right? You couldn't do that with a strategic plan, right? Just like, okay, can you go in that office and write a strategic plan? Well, what do? Just write the damn strategic plan and shut up, right? You can't do that, right? So that's totally fine, but you need to be well aware of your cost. And your cost in a pro bono project is largely the amount of knowledge you have to transfer to that person, whether it's through you or them meeting with your staff or your clients, for them to be able to do their job, right? So if someone's doing a strategic plan, that is very high cost to you because they need to learn what you do, they need to understand the marketplace, they need to understand your economics, they need to understand how nonprofit economics work in the first place. It requires a significant amount of knowledge to be able to help you with a strategic plan. It can totally be worth it. I'm not saying don't do it, but you'd have to do a lot of training for them to be able to do it. Do you have the staff time, and is it worth your staff's time right now relative to all the other stuff we have on your plate to do this project, knowing that it will take up your time? Do you have the time, or do you have the staff members' time to do this properly? The second question is, does your organization really want this, or just you want it, right? So one of my favorite interviews I did with a nonprofit maybe 8 years ago was with an executive director. There was a Boys and Girls Club in Oakland, California. She said, I really want a new website. I was like, that's great. What does your board think? They don't want us to, but when they see it, they are going to love it, right? That's just a recipe for disaster. Like, that's not fair to the pro bono consultants to come in to do a surprise project in the hope that somehow the board will like it even though they don't want it, right? So this goes to your question about your board, right? Getting them to do a board assessment or doing an assessment of the board, if they don't want it and they're not emotionally or politically ready for that, not a great fit, because they're just going to show them the door as soon as they show up. And that's a really simple, easy one to pick on. And they may very well be there and want that. I'm just saying, from your vantage point, are any of the projects on your list things that either you don't think there's enough staff time right now to work with someone on, or you believe there's not organizational buy-in from the people who need to be bought in, that this is something that you guys need to do right now, versus you just being the proactive agitator to say, we need to do this better?